Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. The topic for our webinar is Exploring Europe's Approach to Using Offshore Wind for Green Hydrogen Production. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA. Before I pass it over to our panelists today, I'd like to go over a few quick webinar logistics. All of our attendees are in listen-only mode. You have the option to join the audio portion of the webinar via telephone or via your computer mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize your webinar console, you can do that by clicking on the orange arrow that you see circled, and you can also click on that orange arrow to expand your webinar console. And one thing that we would love you to do with your webinar console is to submit your questions and your comments. This webinar is going to be in a discussion format, so we'll be answering questions throughout. So please do submit your questions and your comments as you think of them. Final note, this webinar is being recorded. We'll send you an email this afternoon with a link to the webinar recording and a PDF of the short slide deck that we have today. And that'll also be posted on our website, cesa.org/webinars. That's a good URL to know because that is also where we post all of our upcoming and archived webinars. So with that, I'm going to now pass it over to our moderator for today's webinar, Warren Leon. Warren is the Executive Director of the Clean Energy States Alliance, and he is going to get us started.
Hey, thanks very much, Sam. Yes, this webinar is being hosted by the Clean Energy States Alliance, and we're a national membership organization composed of public agencies, primarily state agencies, and you can see our members up there on the screen. If we could go to the next slide. One of the topics we've given a lot of attention to over the years is offshore wind. This is a topic of great importance to many of the states in the CESA membership. And one thing they have been especially interested in recent years is to learn from the European experience because of the fact that Europe has been well in advance of the United States in terms of offshore wind development. So CESA has been bringing information from Europe to the states and to other stakeholders here in the United States. And one of the topics that CESA member states have been especially interested in is the relationship between offshore wind and the potential to produce green hydrogen. Because not only is Europe in advance of the United States in terms of offshore wind development, it's in advance of the United States in terms of producing, developing plans for producing green hydrogen, and especially producing green hydrogen from offshore wind. So that's what we're going to focus on in this hour. CESA with Val Stori, project director for our offshore wind work on offshore wind, produced the report you see on your screen on offshore wind to green hydrogen, insights to Europe. We're going to do this webinar as a discussion. I'll be asking questions we've thought of in advance, but we'll be sprinkling in the questions you write to us as we go along. And we have two people, if we could go to the next slide, who'll be talking to you. Val Stori, who was the lead author on this report, and Lee Wilkinson, who was a contributor to the report. And before I ask questions, I'm going to give them a chance to introduce themselves. And let's start with you, Lee.
Hi, everybody. And yeah, thank you for coming today. And thank you to Clean Energy States Alliance for having me and letting me speak. First, I'll introduce Bvg Associates. So we are a strategic consultancy, and we specialize in offshore wind and related energy systems. We've been active since 2008, so really early on in the development of offshore wind in Europe. And we help governments, help developers, and help people within the supply chain understand opportunities for them in offshore wind and how to develop the industry. We see ourselves definitely as advocates for offshore wind and people who try and make the most of the opportunity that faces countries and companies in the offshore wind space. Recently, As offshore wind has started to globalize, and there's been a lot more activity in Asia, other places in Europe, and the United States, we've started to branch out as well, and we're helping advising a lot of governments on how they can develop offshore wind in their countries. What we've noticed a lot more in the past 2 years is interest in hydrogen as well. So a lot of our clients are very interested in hydrogen. So we've developed capability on helping them understand how the two opportunities are connected and how they can capitalize on both of them. Myself, I have a background in project engineering as well as project development. So developed a number of onshore renewable energy projects as well as offshore, and some of those has included green hydrogen, fuel cells, and electrolyzers, including work both in Europe and also in the US as well.
Hey, thanks very much, Lee. Val, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your role?
Thanks, Warren. Hi, everyone. I'm Val Stori. As Warren said, I'm a project director at the Clean Energy States Alliance, CESA, where I've been for, I think, close to 12 years. And as Warren said, I work on offshore wind. I also work on building decarbonization. And I have to say and give a big kudos to Lee Wilkinson and Bvg for all their help with this report. This report took us approximately a year to research and write, and I'm very excited to be speaking with everyone today and telling you all about everything I've learned in the process. We asked ourselves lots of hard questions. We had some challenging questions that we needed to address, like what is the proper role, or what are some of the potential proper uses for green hydrogen? What are some of the environmental justice implications? And I had a great time researching and fact-finding and talking with experts like Lee and others about green hydrogen, and excited to share what I've learned with everyone.
Hey, thanks very much, Val. So let's jump in. Why don't you start by explaining what green hydrogen is and how is it different from other types of hydrogen?
Sure, I can start with that. So green hydrogen is green hydrogen made with renewable electricity, or it can also be directly from a renewable source, and we'll talk about the offshore, how that's possible with offshore wind later. But you take renewable electricity and you split water through the process of electrolysis, and you get green hydrogen. There are other colors of hydrogen which you've probably heard about. The most common is gray hydrogen, which is made from natural gas and has quite a large carbon footprint. There's blue hydrogen, which has been in the news a lot, which is basically gray hydrogen with carbon capture and storage. And then there's a whole host of a rainbow of colors, which I'm less familiar with. I believe turquoise is nuclear based hydrogen, and perhaps brown hydrogen, which may be coal-based. Lee, you have other insights there?
Yeah, so those are the main ones that you touched on. You have brown, which is hydrogen produced from coal, which is, I guess, the worst kind of hydrogen, the one we don't want to talk about as much. Then you have gray and blue, which is from natural gas. And then turquoise is actually from splitting methane in a slightly different way to how you would do it in blue hydrogen. So it's using a pyrolysis process rather than a steam reformation process. And yeah, as you mentioned, there's hydrogen from nuclear, which sits in a strange spot, whether it's classified as green or whether it's classified as something else. Then that's a debate that's ongoing about how do people want to classify nuclear. Whether it's, do they want to perceive it as an environmental type of hydrogen, or is nuclear best left alone?
Hey, thanks. Hey, and I want to clarify one thing for someone who's coming to this topic new, that actually the hydrogen is not different colors. All hydrogen is without color, and the colors are put on it as a term denoting how clean or dirty it is in terms of its manufacturing process, with green hydrogen being the cleanest. So let's talk about the potential end uses of green hydrogen. Let's do that before we start looking at the relationship between hydrogen and offshore wind. What are some of the potential uses for hydrogen? And why don't you both respond to this one?
Sure, I think we have a slide to share, Sam. It's probably the next slide. Great. I can start, and Lee, I'll turn it over to you. Basically, hydrogen can be used in any application where we currently use oil and gas. The big question is, should it? We'll talk more about that later, but potential end uses, you can use hydrogen fuel for heavy duty transportation. You can also use it for light duty transportation in passenger cars, but hydrogen could play a significant role in decarbonizing long distance trucking, heavy duty trucking, shipping, maritime activities, trains, buses, aviation. You may be familiar with fuel cell forklifts, so there is a role for hydrogen in material handling vehicles. Lee, I'll let you talk about some of the others.
Yeah, so heat is a big one, and it's a big one particularly for Europe. A lot of places in Europe rely on natural gas for heat, and that's both industrial, as you can see on the screen. Industry and manufacturing uses a lot of gas to produce heat, really at very high temperatures, many hundreds of degrees Celsius. And hydrogen could be used in those applications. You can burn it in boilers and furnaces, very similar to gas. And then even at lower temperatures, such as the heating in our homes, that uses much smaller boilers to get lower temperature, hot water and steam. Again, hydrogen is a good stand-in there for natural gas, with, of course, its own drawbacks and engineering challenges that it must meet. Moving away from heat, two quite interesting uses is in the power sector. And there's a lot of debate which the report goes into, and I'm sure Val will have some thoughts on it, where you can use it to provide grid stability. Unlike some renewable sources, which rely on inverters to connect to the grid, you could have hydrogen engines and gas turbines that kind of are, from the grid's point of view, almost a direct stand-in for gas turbines. So very good for grid stability and being able to deliver long-term storage on the power network.
Yeah, and I'll tease that apart just a little bit more. So for stationary power, green hydrogen can be used in fuel cells to provide electricity, or they could be combusted in a conventional power plant to produce electricity. And it's similar with the storage. We can store the hydrogen in salt caverns or compressed tubes or trailers. We can talk more about that later. And then when needed, the hydrogen can then be used in fuel cells, or it can again be fed into the power plant to provide that power on demand.
So, Lee, what are some of the reasons why European policymakers and the offshore wind industry are especially interested in making a connection between offshore wind and hydrogen?
Yeah, so in Europe, a very simplified view of where Europe is at in its decarbonisation journey is many European countries have done a very good job of decarbonising their electricity system and beginning to decarbonise their electricity system by introducing a lot of renewable electricity into the grids. The challenges that are starting to face is questions over long-term storage. How do you balance a grid when it has so many different renewable sources? They also are now looking to decarbonize harder to decarbonize sectors, such as the ones we have on screen here in transport and heating. In many countries, particularly in Europe and Northwestern Europe, heating is a large part of the energy use in the country because we have a colder climate. So there's a lot more energy needed to provide heat, both residentially and industrially. And a lot of that is provided by gas currently. So the first kind of key reason why Europe is looking at hydrogen is many people see it as a good replacement for natural gas that we're using. As soon as you start to say, okay, well, we want to use hydrogen in our energy system, now you have to find the best places to get it. And for many European countries, that's wind. Europe has very good offshore wind resources that they began to capitalize on and good onshore wind resources. So there alone, there's a link between hydrogen and offshore wind, where Europe can start to make the connection on how it can decarbonize some more of its energy system. Now, there's a few more subtleties to that. The first one is to get the cost for hydrogen down, keep the cost low. It's best to produce hydrogen at scale. So large electrolysis plants producing lots of green hydrogen that can then be moved around the energy system. One benefit of offshore wind is that it is very good at being deployed at scale. Many wind farms being deployed today are in excess of 1 gigawatt. So compared to other sources of renewable electricity like onshore wind and solar, you can get larger economies of scale if you power up your hydrogen production with offshore wind. Additionally, offshore wind has quite a high capacity factor. So you not only are you able to produce hydrogen at scale, but you can produce it a lot of the time, which is great for the hydrogen plant because it's a big capital investment. So you want to be able to be producing hydrogen using that electrolysis equipment as much as possible. A third reason, which is quite an interesting one, is there's so much renewable electricity now in Europe and many of the grids that one of the key constraints to building some new renewable capacity is actually getting adequate connection to the electricity system. That comes in the form of curtailment potentially for some onshore renewable projects. It also comes in the form of having to wait for your grid connection to become available. And there's a lot of competition for it. So what hydrogen can do is it's another outlet for energy for offshore wind. So rather than having to pay a lot or wait a long time for a new grid connection to become available, you can potentially put some of your capacity into production of hydrogen, which will allow you to get your project built quicker. And finally, one last one before I let Val jump in with some thoughts is a lot of the entrants into the offshore wind market now, we've seen over the past year, big oil and gas players like BP, Shell, Total, Eni. A lot of those large oil and gas companies are starting to move into offshore wind. And they're starting to think, as big companies, how do they fit into a net zero picture, a decarbonized world? They have a lot of expertise in offshore engineering. So offshore wind is a very attractive opportunity for them. And so is hydrogen, because it does tie in with a lot of the core capabilities and experience that those companies have. So the marriage of that is one of the kind of unique selling points of those companies and something that they can bring uniquely to the energy industry.
So, Lee, what are some of the concepts folks in Europe are kicking around for how to structure the production and distribution of hydrogen from offshore wind?
Yeah, so for offshore wind, there's a few different concepts of how you can produce hydrogen. You can break them down, you can kind of categorize them into buckets. So the first categorization is whether you produce the hydrogen onshore or offshore. So in the onshore scenarios, you could have an electrolyzer plant, hydrogen production plant, that connects to an offshore wind farm via a cable that connects the wind farm offshore to the electrolyzer system onshore. Then you can produce your hydrogen onshore and then transport it wherever it needs to go via a number of ways. Ship, you can transport it via pipeline or via tanker vessel or road vessel. So that's one concept. Onshore, you can either be connected just to the wind farm, or you could be also connected to the grid. And that allows you to potentially use power when the wind farm isn't generating power, so you can still produce your hydrogen. And the grid can use you as a demand side response. So the grid can use you to take power or use power to help balance itself. So that's one of the benefits of having the electrolyzer plant onshore rather than offshore right at the wind farm. Offshore, there's a few different concepts you can do. So if you are generating hydrogen offshore, you can do it at the turbine itself. So if you have an offshore wind farm with 50 turbines, each turbine can have its own hydrogen production plant. And you can connect all those turbines up with pipes to a central export pipeline and transport all the hydrogen back to shore where it needs to go. And there's a few different projects that are investigating that at a demonstration level. So Aquaventus is one in Germany that's investigating an on-turbine electrolyzer concept. There is a few that are looking at floating wind turbines with electrolyzers on, so such as the ERM Dolphin project in Scotland. Then the other offshore concept is centralized on-platform hydrogen production. So this is much similar to an offshore oil and gas rig, except rather than connecting to a well in the ground, you have a power cable connecting you to the wind farm, and then you have, on the platform, you have all your electrolyzers and hydrogen production plant, and you produce all of the hydrogen from all of the offshore wind farm on this one platform. And then from that platform, you can then potentially have vessels that can come and offtake the hydrogen, or again, you can have pipelines that take it to where it needs to go. So a few different technical solutions are being investigated.
Hey,
Warren,
Val.
can I jump in?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so for some schematics, if you want to see what a topside or an on-turbine platform electrolyzer configuration might look like, there's some schematics in the report, which we would recommend you take a look at. But Warren, I wanted to go back to the first question you asked, Lee, about the reasons European policymakers and the offshore wind industry might be interested in green hydrogen, especially because one of the reasons we wrote this report is we wanted to advise US policymakers, particularly states, so what and how they should be thinking about hydrogen. And there's some really big differences between where Europe is and where the US is. And I think for me, one of the big ones is that Europe and the European states have legally binding targets to achieve carbon emission reductions, like significant ones, net zero ones, 55% by 2030 compared to 1990 at the EU level. So you're talking about some of the most ambitious decarbonization targets in the world are in place in policy in Europe. And then in addition, you have an offshore wind energy industry that is mature and is growing, and costs are declining rapidly. So 70 gigawatts of offshore wind projects are expected to come online in Europe by 2028 and 300 gigawatts by 2050. And that's huge compared to where we are in the US. And because of that growth, offshore wind costs since 2015 have dropped dramatically, 45 to 50%, I think is what we found in our research. So those are some very large drivers. In addition, in the report, we did some case studies on different countries, and the proposition, the interest in offshore wind to green hydrogen is different in different countries. Germany, for example, and Lee talked about this, there are limited interconnection points, there's grid congestion, and in Germany, much of the offshore wind resource is located in the North Sea, to the north of the country, where there are severe grid limitations that restrict the ability to transport power offshore to the demand areas in the south. And that's where potentially being able to produce hydrogen could reduce the grid connection capacity issues and enable more installation of offshore wind.
Okay, that all makes sense. Thanks for adding that additional information. But
I think Lee might have had
another question
a point
for you, Val.
Sorry, Lee, yes.
Sorry. Okay. Go on.
Lee,
I just wanted to add on to what Val said, which was a really good point about Germany and how the opportunity is different in different countries. So one good point that Val made was Germany has a lot of its offshore wind resource in the north, and it needs to get power to the south. Another dynamic though is that Germany is a big industrial user of energy. So it also needs a lot of hydrogen to feed its industrial industry, which heavily relies on gas currently. Its offshore wind resource is actually quite saturated. It's reaching its kind of maximum capacity of offshore wind, and is not going to be able to produce all of its own hydrogen. So what that does for other states like Denmark, which does have offshore wind resource, and other countries, is it presents a potential export opportunity for them. They can use their offshore wind resource to then start producing hydrogen and sending power to other countries within Europe that desperately need that hydrogen. So yeah, the dynamic of how offshore wind and hydrogen presents different opportunities within Europe is quite an interesting one.
And as both of you have indicated in the report, there's good information on what's going on in the different countries, and readers can see the range of different opportunities and different strategies. But one thing I don't want to ignore is that hydrogen is also controversial. And much of the controversy around hydrogen has to do with its use for power generation. And several of the folks on the call have written in with questions about that. But Val, can you explain what some of the issues are related to the use of hydrogen for power generation?
Sure. Yes. As I mentioned earlier, hydrogen has a variety of uses. Can be used in almost any application. We currently use oil and gas, and the question is, should it? And so we start really thinking about that when it comes to combustion for power generation. Using generating electricity from fuel cells is a different issue, as is blue hydrogen with carbon capture and storage. But when we think about green hydrogen, the first issue, let's take it back a step, is that round trip efficiencies are pretty low. To get with current electrolyzer efficiency from production back to energy through combustion, we're talking about 18 to 45% efficiency. So that means a large portion of the renewable energy that we're pouring in to make green hydrogen is lost, upwards of 82%. So that's one factor. It's high. It can be a bit higher, the efficiencies in next generation electrolyzers as well as next generation fuel cells. But Warren, the point you're getting to is the combustion issue and the NOx emissions. And the combustion of natural gas yields NOx, but when you blend hydrogen with natural gas, you're actually increasing, you have the potential to increase your NOx emissions because hydrogen burns hotter, it's more diffuse, so you have to be able to tinker with the flame temperature and the air mixture and the flame speed to reduce your NOx. And most burners in power plants are typically older. There are dry, low NOx generators which can reduce the NOx emissions, but NOx emissions are a health pollutant. They're a pollutant. They greatly affect health, and it turns out that many power plants are in frontline and disadvantaged communities. So the combustion of a blend could increase NOx emissions in those neighborhoods. Blending pure hydrogen may yield just a slight increase in NOx from current natural gas burning. This is not an area of expertise, but it may be, if we could somehow switch to 100% combustion of green hydrogen, the NOx issue wouldn't be as great. But then again, there's not enough green hydrogen in the world, and it is clear from the research I did that there are higher and best uses of the green hydrogen rather than burning it in power plants. Lee, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I think it's so a lot of the controversy around hydrogen, I think, stems from what you mentioned first, Val, which is the round trip efficiency. And why is that controversial? Well, if the world is going to transition and reach its carbon reduction goals, a lot of the tools that policymakers can use rely on taxpayer money. So I think a lot of the controversy is, are we using taxpayers' money and incentivizing the right technologies? Is the money being spent efficiently? Is the cost of energy to people increasing unnecessarily if you go to hydrogen rather than using other technologies? So I think absolutely trying to minimize the round trip efficiency and using hydrogen where it needs to be used, where other technologies either are completely impractical for a technical point of view, so you need to use hydrogen, or where it is more economic to use hydrogen. So where those efficiencies are less important because for other reasons it is more economical to use hydrogen. So from that, you do kind of the uses that we have on screen, not all of them are equal when it comes to use of hydrogen. Some you know, the competition from battery storage, for example, may be more prevalent in some of those sectors, such as fuel cell road vehicles, than it is in other sectors, such as providing heat upwards of 600 degrees Celsius. The use of hydrogen in those areas is more beneficial than in others. So I think to avoid controversy, yeah, a lot of work needs to be done to identify where hydrogen is best placed to be used and where those efficiencies can be minimized, where those losses can be minimized.
Hey, thank you. You know, up to now, you've been talking generally around the topic of hydrogen and its potential use for offshore wind, but let's talk specifically about, Lee, what are different countries doing and what are they planning?
Yeah, so in Europe, a lot of countries are starting to, the first step in the process is starting to establish targets. So the EU, for example, has a target of 40 gigawatts of electrolyzers by 2030. Germany has a target of 5 gigawatts. The UK also has a target of 5 gigawatts. And many other European countries have very similar targets that I can't remember off the top of my head, but in the report and in other places you will find full lists of European countries that have various targets for electrolyzer production and hydrogen production. So alongside those targets, then there's kind of strategies about how that can be achieved, where the hydrogen might come from, how projects will be financed. In the UK, for example, since we published our report, the UK actually released a hydrogen strategy that fleshed out their ideas a little bit more. So I'd just like to kind of tell everyone a little bit about what's come out, what's new since we released our study. So the UK government is, they have a 5 gigawatt by 2030 plan. Now they're going to get that from a mixture of green hydrogen, which is from electrolyzer, and from blue hydrogen, which, as we mentioned earlier, is from natural gas with carbon capture. And how they intend to do that, they've allocated 240 million for government co-invested projects, and that's very similar to other countries. Similar approaches taken in Germany, where the government is co-funding initial projects to incentivize private investment in projects. What they're also doing in the UK, which is going to be very influential in getting new projects built, is they are currently consulting on business models where they will subsidize production of green hydrogen on a per kilogram of hydrogen produced basis. So they haven't defined those rules exactly, but it will look very similar to a contract for difference process, which is similar to how renewable energy has been incentivized in the UK and other places in Europe currently. Functions somewhat similar to the kind of RES scheme in some of the US states. So that's one thing that they're looking at, which they hope will be kind of the key to unlocking private investment and allowing them to reach the 5 gigawatt target. In addition to that, what a lot of countries are looking at is the supply chain and how not only can they stimulate a hydrogen market in their countries, but also make sure that they have R&D that goes on and they stimulate manufacturing in those countries. Europe has some of the biggest electrolyzer manufacturers in the world in ITM Power, Siemens, Nel. So many countries are allocating funding to make sure that those manufacturing facilities can grow and that they can continue to do research and development to improve the technology and reduce costs.
Hey, Val, do you want to add anything in about what's going on in Europe?
Sure, yes, and actually I'm going to ask Lee a question too, but in the report we looked at, the end has a case study on the UK, on Germany, and on Denmark. One country we didn't cover was the Netherlands, but their proposition and their interests are very much aligned with Germany. But back to my original point, every country has a different reason for being interested in green hydrogen. It could be from the supply side or the demand side. But what I took out of doing this research is that countries are very invested in getting ahead of the growth and being very thoughtful about the why of hydrogen. Why do we need it? Where do we need it? And how are we going to get it here? So you heard Lee say there's a 40 gigawatt target for electrolyzers. The interim target, I think, is 6 gigawatts maybe by 2025. That's still huge growth. So countries in Europe are very invested in looking into how to grow that electrolyzer capacity and have economic growth as well. Lee, back to the offshore wind hydrogen nexus, you recently were telling me about Ireland's unique offshore wind to green hydrogen proposition. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how Ireland is approaching green hydrogen.
Yeah, so Ireland's situation is it has a high penetration of renewables on its electricity system, and that is primarily from onshore wind. It sits right next to the Atlantic, so it gets a lot of winds directly from the Atlantic, which doesn't make it a good holiday destination, but does make it a good place to generate wind energy. Ireland, however, does have quite a small demand for electricity. I think its electricity peak demand is around 3 to 5 gigawatts, so not very much, and yet its offshore wind potential is in the tens of gigawatts. So what Ireland has is a high potential for offshore wind energy, low demand, and so previously it had been slow to kind of grow its offshore wind market because it didn't really have a need to yet, but recently its government has come on board. They have very strong policies for decarbonisation, and they put in a pipeline of offshore wind projects and a process to get those projects built by the end of the decade. So Ireland's offshore wind capacity is going to grow quite quickly over the next decade, and it could even outstrip its peak demand for electricity. So what that means is it's starting to look at export options. So it's starting to think about, well, can I use interconnected cables to connect to France and Britain to export some of the power, which it already does, and no doubt that will be part of the answer. But also hydrogen is a big opportunity for it. And a lot of people we've been speaking to, they're well aware of that opportunity. And what's interesting in Ireland, rather than necessarily thinking just about how they can capture the offshore wind potential and opportunity, a lot of the people that are also thinking about how they can do hydrogen at the same time. So rather than develop a port that can facilitate the offshore wind industry, why don't I build a port that can facilitate the offshore wind industry and also import and export hydrogen? So they're starting to think about the two opportunities together as one opportunity. And that's similar for other countries as well. I think it's a trend that we'll see over the next decade is countries with small demand but good resources will be thinking about how they can start to export energy, whether it's in the form of power through cables or through hydrogen. Australia is another good example of this, not in Europe, but it's another good example where you can see that they've identified excess renewable energy as an opportunity for them to start exporting hydrogen. And they're looking at that export to Asia, to a lot of the Asian markets.
And I brought that up because, sorry, the Netherlands and Germany have large industrial clusters on the shore. And so they will be looking at imports, green hydrogen imports to decarbonize their industrial clusters. And where would it come from? Potentially from some of these direct offshore wind to green hydrogen connections.
Good. Well, you're painting a picture of a lot of momentum behind offshore wind to hydrogen in Europe, but there are also some obstacles and barriers to making this happen. What are the obstacles to doing a big rapid push of offshore wind to hydrogen?
I can start with the high level, and Lee, if you want to follow up. So there are definitely cost challenges, and there are legal and policy challenges. And we've already talked about the electrolyzer manufacturing capacity challenge, so that will need to scale up and costs will need to come down. The electrolyzers, I believe, make up 50 to no, 10 to 20% of the cost of green hydrogen, and then renewable energy is the other main cost component of green hydrogen, making 50 to 70% of total cost. So that's another cost challenge right there, is getting the cost of renewable energy down a little bit further to make green hydrogen cost effective. And then just getting legislative, regulatory, and policy support for green hydrogen is another challenge. For example, standardization of pipeline quality, safety standardization, for example. Lee, do you want to jump in? You probably have some numbers in mind.
Yeah, so the first challenge, and this is the one of the biggest challenges for hydrogen, which is, if I can compare it to electricity, when we wanted to make the switch from electricity produced from coal and gas to electricity produced from solar and wind, what that was, we were swapping out one technology for another and connecting it into a system that existed. So it was not a simple process, there was still a lot of challenges, but it wasn't a full system overhaul. Whereas what we're presenting with hydrogen is, not only do you have to swap out where the energy is coming from, but you also have to swap out the demand side users as well. So there's supply side changes and demand side changes which need to happen. And that produces a chicken and egg scenario. If I'm an industrial manufacturing site, I'm not going to switch to hydrogen before cheap hydrogen is available. But we can't get to the point where cheap hydrogen is available until there's plenty of demand. So there needs to be a role for policymakers to get in there, connect up sectors that are kind of that have the best opportunities for hydrogen, and connect supply side and demand side together and work together to get that transition started. So that's the first thing. The other issue that you have is very hard to get people to switch until you start to de-risk projects so that people can access finance, so that manufacturers can build new manufacturing facilities, so that people can build projects and get good capital, good rates of capital to do that. So the other element is to kind of guarantee your revenue from them and de-risk a project so that private investors can come in and start investing in the industry. So that's where policymakers can come in and tackle some of these challenges. They can incentivize by providing business schemes or even co-investment. They can help to de-risk the projects and bring that investment in. But yeah, the cost is the major driver. So one of the biggest things, as Val said, about 70% of the cost is the electricity. So there's a challenge on the wider renewables industry to keep lowering costs through kind of measures that they've been working on for many years now, get the cost lower. And then on the electrolyzer side, reducing the cost of there's kind of two approaches to it. One of them is achieving economies of scale in the actual manufacturing facility. So just being able to order more of your balance of plant, more of your compressors to reduce costs. And the other element of that is better design. So rather than designing the electrolyzer stacks at the high, 1 megawatt scale, scaling those designs up so you can develop individual units at 5 megawatts, 10 megawatts plus. So you actually just improve your design through economies of scale, which will only come from building bigger projects.
Lee, do you have any, I think you have a slide or two that shows costs here.
Yeah, if we can flick to those costs, that will be helpful. Yeah, so this is in euros per megawatt hour, so maybe a little bit different to how people are used to seeing hydrogen costs. Sometimes it's quoted in US dollars per kilogram. But you can see here in 2021, the cost is quite high at around 180 euros per megawatt hour. What we see is through a combination of reduction in the cost of energy from offshore wind and about a reduction of 50% in the cost of electrolyzers, we can get hydrogen cost down to around 100 euros per megawatt hour, which is around, you can check the report for the actual value, but off the top of my head, I think that's around $3 per kilogram. But as you can see, it's still quite a lot more than the fuels that it'll be replacing. So natural gas, diesel, different aviation and marine fuels. So there's still a significant amount of reduction needed. The electrolyzer price used in 2030 that we've estimated is around 600 euros per kilowatt. So 600,000 euros per megawatt for the electrolyzer. The cost of that needs to get to around 300 to 400 euros per kilowatt before it starts to become competitive with fossil fuels.
So
it just shows the scale of the reduction, 50% over the next 10 years, then a further kind of 30 to 40% after that.
Yeah, so clearly a large barrier to moving forward is the cost. One attendee in the webinar asked, well, is safety a barrier? Are there safety issues in regard to hydrogen?
This is an area I don't know much about, but yes and no. I think at the blended rate right now, pilot and demonstration projects have shown that a 20% blend, no safety issues have come up. But if we're going to increase the blend, there could be safety issues, and natural gas pipelines, if that's how it's going to be transported, will need new compressors, new valves, new fittings to be safer. And the same with the transport through compressed tube trailers. Other safety issues, Lee?
Yeah, so say again, gas safety is not my area of expertise, but one thing that we can say for sure is that demonstration projects is what is going to answer that question. And there is, as Val alluded to, there is some going on in Europe currently. The high deploy was a big one in the UK, where a gas company, Cadent, they introduced a 20% blend into a university campus. So they almost used the university campus as a mini town as a demonstrator. People there were using it to cook on stoves. They were using it to heat water throughout the university campus. They introduced it, and the results of that said no problems. Very little adaptations were needed on the end user's equipment. And then those trials, there's many of them ongoing now where they're expanding it to town level. In Scotland, we have a project which is going to introduce gas into a kind of isolated village network to test it at a little bit of a broader scale. And I know in Germany they're doing similar activities where the gas companies are starting to test it. So yeah, are there any safety implications? Certainly there's differences between natural gas and hydrogen, but all of the indications from the studies done so far are that those aren't insurmountable. With the correct engineering and, as Val said, changes in certain bits of equipment to prevent leakages and detect hydrogen, all the indications show that it should be safe.
And I would jump in to say that if you think back to the first slide we shared of all the potential end uses for hydrogen, I think we're probably all in agreement that the highest and best use, or the first use of the first green hydrogen at scale, is going to be to decarbonize the industrial sector. And they're already using 130 million tons of gray hydrogen annually around the globe. And so that would just be a switch. The industrial process, it doesn't matter if you're using gray or green hydrogen, it's still the same hydrogen. So we have experience with hydrogen and hydrogen safety because of the gray hydrogen that's currently being used globally.
Hey, that's a very good point, Val. But I want to switch now to the situation in the US. And Val, you hinted at this early on in terms of talking about some of the differences between the state of offshore wind in Europe and in the United States. But could you say a little bit more about that and what that means for using offshore wind to hydrogen here?
Sure, yeah, I think what you've heard throughout this hour, and if you've read the report, big takeaway is that Europe is in a very different place in terms of its policies and the amount of offshore wind energy it already has installed, plus what it's planning to install. So Europe is at a very different stage than the US. That said, if you think about globally an increased amount of variable renewable energy resources on the grid, we also have to think about system balancing, and can the energy transition happen without an energy storage carrier like hydrogen or batteries or another form of storage, and what's the role for green hydrogen there? And then with that in mind, how can you as a government start thinking about legislation, standardization that you can put in place before the market develops? For now, I think for the US, given the limited amount of offshore wind energy that we have installed, the first and best use of that renewable energy is going to be as electricity. We've got a perfect pairing of an offshore wind resource with high load centers. And it's almost the low hanging fruit. Let's decarbonize with electricity directly from those first offshore wind farms, and then think about putting in place and asking the why and the how of green hydrogen, and building policies to support sustainable use of green hydrogen.
Well, given what you were just saying, what does that mean for what states in the United States can and should be doing now, given that there isn't a real need in the immediate future for green hydrogen from offshore wind here in the US?
We could certainly continue to support offshore wind development and renewables in general to get that price down. Remember, Lee said that some of the major challenges are the cost of electricity and the cost of electrolyzers. So if we think that green hydrogen is going to play a role in the future, let's work on getting the cost of renewables down, the amount of renewables up. And then if we look at Europe, the first phase of most country level roadmaps is to get that electrolyzer target up and begin electrolyzer manufacturing or imports. Lee, other takeaways from the roadmaps you've been working on across the globe?
Yeah, so I think BVG works on a lot of roadmaps, particularly focused on offshore wind and how countries can approach developing an offshore wind industry. And increasingly, that includes things like hydrogen. So how can they develop both of them together? Which is a similar position to what the US would be, and they'd be developing the offshore wind industry and hydrogen industry kind of closer in time together than Europe did. But there's a few key things. I think the first one is getting your policy correct to incentivize people to start investing. So things like grant support for projects is a great way to get those demonstration projects installed so you can start learning lessons and start small scale deployment of the technology. The other one is about how to build supply chains, and that's a really crucial one. And a consideration which the US might want to take a little seriously, because Europe and other places are starting to press on with hydrogen and invest in it, and they're starting to build supply chains. If the US also wants to kind of capture the manufacturing of electrolyzers, it is something it kind of might want to start doing sooner rather than later. Otherwise, there might be well-established supply chains for those types of equipment elsewhere in the world. And the third one is to really think. One of the lessons I would give to any policymaker from Europe is that you need to think about demand and supply of hydrogen together from the beginning. So a lot of the initial projects that you'll see in Europe, they are consortiums of lots of different companies. They include demand users as well as supply users. There are very few hydrogen projects being developed right now in Europe that are just somebody thinking about investing in supply. Very typically, a lot of them are connected to a demand user. So one example is a gigastack project in the UK, And that's a partnership of Phillips 66, who are a refinery who will use the hydrogen, and Ørsted and ITM Power, who produce the renewable electricity and the electrolyzer. And they're all working together to make a cohesive system. So any states thinking about hydrogen, start to make the connections between your renewable energy producers and your potential hydrogen end users. And if you can make those connections, then you can start to support them with policies and finance.
And I want to make one more point on policy support. Certainly policy support is important, but we need to ask, what do we want that policy support to do? And I think a big consideration for the US is to recognize, and here I'm talking about green hydrogen, a carbon emissions-free energy carrier, potentially energy source, and we need to ask what's its highest and best use. And we need to really understand the NOx issues if we're going to think about combusting this fuel. Is that a good use? And if we think it is, or before we even go down that road, we really need to involve frontline communities and create opportunities to listen to their concerns and find a path for them to voice their concerns and have a legitimate voice and say what happens to power plants located in their neighborhoods.
Now, those are all very good points, and we just have 3 minutes left in this webinar, so I want to give each of you a minute and a half to say anything you would like to say that you haven't had a chance to say yet. Lee, do you want to go first? Whether you want to or not, you have to go first.
I don't think if there's anything important that I haven't said. I think anybody who's thinking about hydrogen, if you're a policymaker, you need to think about how you can help reduce the cost. So that's policies that will support de-risk projects, whether it's through grant funding or revenue support mechanisms like RESs and different things like that. I think anyone in the hydrogen industry, if they had the ear of a policymaker, would ask for that. They would ask, we need some help to support our cost reduction journey. If you're out there and you're thinking about how you can use hydrogen, or thinking about where you might sell hydrogen if you start to develop it, I would say, yeah, if you want to develop a hydrogen plant, start to think about where it's going to go. And as Val said, think about the merit order. Not all uses of hydrogen are equal. Some of them make more sense, some of them make less sense. And trying to, get the right level on that value scale is going to be very important to making sure you have a competitive, commercially viable project.
Hey, thanks, Lee. Val, what are your famous last words?
I don't know about famous. So one thing I've been thinking about is what makes this current round of interest in hydrogen so much different than 10 years ago, 20 years ago, even further back. For me, the interesting green hydrogen, what's different from 10 years ago when I was doing a little work on hydrogen and fuel cells, now we have massive amounts of renewables available globally. So that's a big difference. And I think hydrogen, this green hydrogen is here, and it's going to play a role in the clean energy transition. Hopefully it will be part of a just energy transition. That said, things are changing rapidly across the globe, and even some of the country level policies and strategies that we took a look at in Europe are changing and are being revised, and some were purposefully left broad so that as countries learn more, they can go back and make revisions. And I just want to highlight one country that we didn't highlight in the report, and this just came to my attention a couple of days ago, is that Belgium recently released a hydrogen strategy. And in my opinion, it is very clear that hydrogen will play a role in decarbonization, but they're only talking about green hydrogen, and that it will be used in those highest best use scenarios. So heavy duty trucking, for example, maritime, and potentially energy storage. So they're not talking about combustion, for example, in their hydrogen roadmap.
Hey, thanks to both of you for covering a lot of ground over this hour. I think anybody listening to this would realize how interesting and complicated a topic this is and how much you have to say about it. So I hope that will drive people to go to the report and read it, where there's a lot more information. It's a good primer to really understand the relationship between offshore wind and hydrogen. So thanks to all of you who joined and listened in today, and join us for future webinars. Bye now.
Thank you, Warren. Thanks, Lee.
Thanks, everybody.